Iran may have just started one of the most dangerous games of recent years. A game that isn't just about missiles, drones, and direct strikes, but about something much bigger. About an attempt to draw the United States into a conflict that won't have a quick end, clear boundaries, or a cheap solution. A conflict that could spread fire across the entire Middle East, shake up oil prices, threaten key global trade routes, and force Washington to respond more and more forcefully. On the internet, this strategy is being called Operation Madman. And when you look at what's happening in practice, that name doesn't sound exaggerated at all. Pressure on Hormuz, threats against the energy sector, messages directed at American bases, and increasing chaos throughout the entire region. This no longer looks like an ordinary retaliation. This looks like an attempt to create a trap in which America will not only fight Iran, but also the consequences of its own response. And that's exactly what makes the whole situation so dangerous. Iran doesn't have to defeat the United States in the traditional way. It's enough if they push them into a war that will be long, expensive, and increasingly uncontrollable. Into a war where not only the front will be burning, but also oil, gas, transportation, markets, and the nerves of the whole world. And that's exactly why we're listening today, to find out what's behind the name Operation Madman and whether Iran is really driving the United States of America into a deadly trap. Iran knows very well that in a classic direct war, it doesn't have an advantage against the United States. America has a stronger air force, a bigger navy, a wider network of bases, and logistics that Iran simply doesn't have. So if Tehran played this game as an ordinary one-on-one war, it would be entering a conflict where it's weaker from the very beginning. That's exactly why it's much more likely that it's not trying to defeat America in the traditional sense of the word, but rather to drag it into a war where its strength stops being as much of an advantage as it looks like on paper. For Iran, the goal doesn't have to be to destroy the United States in a single decisive battle. It's enough if it gets them into a war that is long, expensive, confusing, and increasingly difficult to sell politically, both at home and abroad. Into a war where it won't be enough to just respond to a single attack, but at the same time deal with bases, allies, trade routes, energy, regional stability, and the reputation of American power. The more points Washington has to protect at once, the more its enormous military superiority can turn into a burden. And that could be the very core of the whole trap. Not in one big battle, but in spreading the pressure in several directions at once. Hormuz is just one of the levers in this, although a very strong and well-known one. Something else is more important. Iran doesn't need to lock down the entire region hermetically. It's enough if it creates enough chaos, uncertainty, and costs to make America get more deeply involved in a conflict that could spiral out of its control. Iran isn't just trying to respond to strikes. What's much more dangerous is that it's trying to spread pressure throughout the entire region so that America doesn't have to deal with just one problem, but an entire network of problems at once. And that's exactly the moment when military superiority can turn into a trap. Because the more places Washington has to protect, the higher the costs, the greater the pressure on logistics, the higher the risk of mistakes, and the greater the political price of the entire operation. Just look at what's happening around the Persian Gulf. It's long since stopped being just the Iran-Venchishov-Israel line. American bases, Gulf states, oil and gas infrastructure, ports, tankers, and entire supply routes are coming into the picture. Iran is basically saying that if its territory is going to burn, it won't burn alone. And that's a much worse scenario for America than a single isolated military response. Suddenly, it's not just about how hard to strike back, but also about how many other targets will be put at risk by doing so. Reuters and Associated Press are now describing exactly this kind of shift. Threats to energy infrastructure in the Gulf, pressure on shipping, attacks and retaliatory actions that push the conflict further from its original core and turn it into a regional crisis. And that may be the most important point of this whole so-called Madman operation. Not to destroy America, but to force it to put out more and more fires at the same time. Allied bases, energy, shipping, deterrence reputation, and even nervous markets. Every next step may then seem like a necessary response, but at the same time, it may help Iran fulfill exactly the logic it needs. Not a quick victory, but a war that grows, becomes more expensive, and gets out of control. And this is exactly where the whole scale shifts from war to an economic shock. Iran doesn't have to strike the United States directly on its own territory to put it under pressure. It's enough if it hits the place where today's world is most vulnerable. Energy. Oil, gas, transportation, terminals, fuses, shipping routes, and everything that comes with it. The moment the conflict spills over into this area, it stops being just a problem of the Middle East. Suddenly, markets, governments, companies, and ordinary people far from the front feel it too. And that's exactly where one of the most dangerous Iranian trump cards might lie. It's no coincidence that in recent days there's been so much talk about energy infrastructure in Iran and in the Gulf countries. Reuters describes that after attacks on key Iranian gas facilities, there have been more warnings, retaliations, and threats against energy targets in the region. So the war is not only moving across the map, but also through gas, oil, and infrastructure on which a large part of the world depends. And when the conflict reaches this point, Iran gains leverage that is much greater than the size of its army alone. It gains the ability to raise the cost of the entire war for everyone else. This is important for one more reason as well. America knows how to respond with force. It can destroy targets, send ships, aircraft, and increase military pressure. However, it's much harder to fight against rising energy prices, nervous markets, and regional panic. There, it's not enough to show military superiority. That's where the fight for time, stability, and political endurance begins. And this is exactly where the trap can start working at full force. The more the conflict affects energy, the more the war becomes a problem for the whole world, and the harder it is to get out of it without further escalation. The G7 has already openly declared its readiness to protect energy supplies and the safety of navigation, which in itself shows that this is not a marginal issue, but the very core of the current crisis. And everything is excellent with the basic proposal. They are all growing. For Iran to act as a player, the opportunities created within the proposal are excellent, and this pushes it into nervous and increasingly costly decisions. Excellent. Washington hears threats against shipping, energy, bases, and the entire regional infrastructure at once, and is not just beginning to address a military response. It is also beginning to address what could fall apart if it responds too weakly, or, on the other hand, too harshly. And that's exactly where the strength of this strategy may lie. Not in Iran winning a conventional war, but in forcing a stronger opponent to act under pressure, in uncertainty, and with growing fear of the next step. That also corresponds to today's developments. America gave Iran a 48-hour ultimatum to fully open the Strait of Hormuz and threatened strikes on power plants, while Iran responded that if its energy targets are hit, it may retaliate with attacks on American and regional assets. This is no longer just a military clash, but also a battle of nerves and determination. And that's why the name Operation Madman, although it may be media-driven, actually fits this logic quite well. Not because Iran is acting chaotically, quite the opposite. The dangerous thing is that it can deliberately create the impression that with every new reaction, the conflict could spiral even further out of control. And when the opponent believes that they're not facing a player who can be easily predicted and pushed into a corner, they become more cautious, more nervous, and at the same time more prone to overreacting. If you look at it without any unnecessary embellishments, the pattern is simply there. Iran is not pressing on just one point, but on several sensitive spots at the same time. On shipping, energy, America's regional partners, and even on Washington's own nerves. And that's exactly why it doesn't look like a series of isolated incidents, but rather like a deliberate way to apply increasing pressure. You don't need to have a document with the name of some operation to see it. What's important is that the individual steps fit together. Every additional pressure increases the cost of the conflict, expands the range of threatened targets, and forces the United States to consider where they actually need to respond before it's too late. And that's exactly why this logic makes sense, not as a legend. A real way of fighting that can drag America deeper and deeper. So the question is no longer whether Iran knows how to set a trap. We can already see that to a large extent. The question is how far this whole thing can go and at what point a dangerous game turns into an open regional fire. The coming days will show whether Iran is just escalating this game or whether it is really trying to push it to the brink of a regional explosion. The first scenario is that the pressure will continue, but both sides will still leave room so that the conflict doesn't completely get out of hand. Attacks, retaliations, threats, tension in transportation and markets, but still without the whole region plunging into a full-scale blaze. However, even that would mean a long and costly crisis, with rising oil prices, growing anxiety among allies, and increased pressure for further American action. The second scenario is much worse. The conflict could spread even further throughout the region, affecting other energy targets, bases, or transportation in the Persian Gulf. And then the question will no longer be whether America will get more deeply involved, but how deeply and for how long. And then there's a third scenario, which is the most dangerous one for the United States. Not the one in which Iran would win militarily, but the one in which America would manage to strike hard, but at the cost of getting involved in an even wider, longer, and more expensive war. That's exactly when this trap would start working at full force. Not as a single dramatic moment, but as a series of seemingly inevitable decisions that together create a conflict that's much harder to leave than it was to enter.
If you like the video, I'd appreciate a like and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the others I'm currently working on. You can support my work through gratitude. If you'd like to help the video reach more people, please click praise. Thank you.